Today, I'm going to be looking at heroes that, despite them being nerfed or even reworked, still remained prevalent in many of the metas that we see today. The first most obvious hero to feature here has to be Brigitte. Real ones will remember the You're Not Justin videos covering just how broken she was. So much so that Justin climbed from Hardstock Plat all the way to Masters in a single video. Then he climbed to Grandmaster shortly after. The most broken parts about Brigitte was her insta-heal repair packs that gave up to 75 additional armor, which in the Goats meta basically functioned as a second lifeline. Not to mention, her shield is over double the HP it is nowadays and had the ability to stun through shields. She single-handedly enabled the Goats meta, which, say what you want about it, but most people can agree that it went on for far too long. And despite fans booing teams that would switch back to Goats constantly,
but as soon as they see the defensive setup, they will just simply swap it away. Crucial time lost here for the Outlaws.
The viewership for the Overwatch League was the highest it had ever been. Goats was such a staple in Overwatch history that there's videos today harking back to its past, as well as tournaments in Big 2025 that center entirely around Goats. However, of course 222 came around, as well as Brig's first initial rework. To put it short, she could still brawl a bit, but she was no longer a tank disguised as a support. Despite this, her sheer AoE healing combined with Baptiste enabled the double shield comp. Many anti-6v6ers still use this when arguing for 5v5. In fact, the comp was so hated that a screenshot from Shock pulled over 500,000 views. It's no surprise then that the armor overheal on her packs got reduced down to 50 in February of 2020, but of course, this was still too broken, so half a year later, they straight up removed it. Still, this was also too broken, so 2 months after, they cut 50 HP off Brig and decreased her Inspire healing by over 30%. Now, in 2021, she was then featured in the Brig Zen Bull meta. The Shanghai Dragons harnessed and refined it, stomping the second best team at the time, the Atlanta Reign. Of course, nothing happened during most of 2021 and 2022 because of Overwatch 2's developments. But we know how that story ends. And on the game's release, Brig got her stun removed from her shield to be reworked to what it is now today. So did the stun nerf finally get Brigitte out of the meta? No, of course it didn't. In summer of 2023, she was practically a must-pick in the Sombra Tracer dive meta, mostly because support players were playing FNAF anytime they touched a hero that wasn't Brig. Don't forget that content creators were doom posting about her new ultimate too, which had its pros and cons. Mostly that it was a way more defensive ultimate, but the trade-off is that the value of Rally would decrease over its runtime. Anyways, Brig did get nerfed but only slightly, and fast forward a year to Juno's release, Brig is meta once again. 99% of teams were playing the Brig Juno backline in Stockholm because Brig covers the biggest downside of Juno, being her lack of sustain. Nowadays, Haz has come into the fray. The Brig Juno Malgo comp has seen less play, but it's still potent, especially with hero bans. So why has it been impossible to nerf Brig? Well, I think it's because Brig is no longer the issue. Sure, Brig has been hard meta twice in Overwatch 2, but it wasn't because of Brig. Tracer and Sombra were extremely broken in 2023 due to the hack from Invis and the ult cycling from EMP and Nano Boost. Juno single-handedly enabled the Malgo comp to exist because Orbital Ray was and still is broken. It's just that Brig happened to synergize very well with Juno. Aside from that, Brig has had long periods where she's not meta, especially at the beginning of Overwatch 2, where everyone wanted to run Kiriko, Hog, Sojourn, and Mercy. So it might be a hot take, but I think Brig is actually in a good state right now. She serves a purpose, has a defined identity, without being overbearing to the player base. Featuring yet another support, Kiriko has almost always been a persistent issue among players. On release, she was broken in both ranked and team play. In ranked, players loved running Kiriko Hog because the Suzu would counter one of Hog's biggest counters, being Arnonade, and Kitsune Rush paired very well with Hog's ults. In team play, she was mainly played as a replacement to Moira because of how broken Kitsune Rush was. Even after her ultimate got nerfed, it was still pretty strong. Then, a whole debate about Kiriko's TP emerged. About a year ago, a Twitter clip from Metro went viral, showing the low-risk, high-reward playstyle that Kiriko's TP fully enables. I did also make a video about this at the time because I believed Metro was in the right, but content creators were just too scared to agree with such a controversial figure. Throughout the majority of 2024, Kiriko's been a staple of the meta, mostly because of Lucio Kiriko, but Kiriko is such a flexible character that she can be played with the majority of most other supports. She only really dropped off at the end of the year, but don't worry, we'll get into Juno later. I will say that for some reason, the devs changed and ultimately buffed how Kiriko's kunais worked, and due to the dominance of Juno, the devs also reverted a ton of nerfs to Kiriko's kits. I've always said this about Kiriko, but you need to start nerfing the parts of her kit that disproportionately affect top level players. Abusing TP distance to flank and not only kill DPS, but escape whenever you want is not okay for the game. I'm afraid that other, more problematic heroes are hogging the spotlight, so people don't really care about Kiriko. Finally switching roles, I need to briefly talk about Sojourn. I've covered her railgun in depth in this past video, but I want to make a point about Sojourn. On release, she was hard meta. Now almost 3 years since the Overwatch 2 beta, she's still hard meta. Surprisingly, we did see quite a bit of Soldier in the 2022 league. I assume it's because of how consistent he felt in 5v5. Not to mention, sprint was important for moving around and using the map. But the second Queen came around, everyone knew how broken Sojourn was. She was a staple in the Queen meta, the Winston Kiriko meta, the ranked Sojourn Mercy meta, any ranged Brawl meta, any Bap Iliari meta, and any Doom or Winston meta where Sombra wasn't broken. She was also in most Malga Orisa metas, so as you can see, she's basically a jack of all trades. The only meaningful nerf that the devs did to Sojourn, they pretty much immediately reverted, or at least compensated with a flurry of buffs. Buffing Sojourn's SMG and nerfing her railgun was a good change because it didn't affect lower level players that much. It also opened up that hit scan spot like we've never seen before. Widowmaker, Ashe, and to a lesser extent Cassidy were all played over Sojourn at one point or another, but then they just have to buff her railgun for no actual reason. Now before I go into the final hero in this video, I do want to go over some quick honorable mentions. Juno could be a good shout. She's still very good despite multiple nerfs, but she's a fairly new hero. So I don't think it's fair to fully dedicate a section towards her. The same goes to Hazard, but even more so. I know that we've had a Hazard meta for the last month or so, but hopefully in just a few days, he'll get nerfed. Malga's an interesting choice because despite the devs nerfing him, he's still been meta for a good portion of his lifetime. But with that being said, Malga is very much a hero who's either terrible or broken based on his stats. So in theory, it is possible to nerf him. However, the devs just choose not to. The same logic applies to Orisa, who did get dumpstered by the devs, and even Alec Dawson says as much. She did get micro buffed to hell thereafter, which I do have a video on. The devs can and did kill the hero for at least a few months. Widowmaker was also a very contentious hero. She is technically impossible to nerf because the devs won't remove her one-shots. However, with Sojourn in the meta and good flankers like Sombra, Widow won't be much of an issue. I do talk about it in my problem with Widow video, and to put it short, it's less that Widow is impossible to nerf, and more so that her counters are impossible to buff. Winston could definitely feature in this video, but whenever he's been meta, it hasn't been because he's been super broken. It just so happens to be that he's the best dive tank in the game. We've actually seen this with Hazard, a character that many coaches believe is just a better Winston with a higher value ceiling. Now, the last hero I want to feature is Tracer. To get the obvious point out the way, she's barely been played whenever the meta just so happens to be hard brawl. Goats is the most obvious case, but also the Malga comp too. With that being said, Tracer has never, in Overwatch's history, been a bad hero. It does depend on how you define bad, but Tracer has historically gotten few changes. So, whenever a broken hero gets nerfed and the meta is more diverse, Tracer is almost always at the top. Not to mention, top 500 leaderboards, no matter the season, always had Tracer at the top. The biggest changes to Tracer are slight tweaks to her damage numbers and her falloff. To be honest, there's little point going over them, because even at her worst, Tracer is just okay. I don't think we'll ever see a period of time where leaderboards will just never have Tracer in them. Anyways, that's it for the video. If you enjoyed, be sure to let me know down below, and check out my coaching too if you want to improve. Until next time.